All right, let's get back to looking at some of the emergence of state-level society in China. And we're going to look at three dynasties here. And by me mentioning the word dynasty, I guess you can guess that we're going to be on a more traditional trajectory than we saw at Harappa, where they didn't really seem to have this dynastic structure or even really much of a top-down rule at all. The dynasties refer to the emergence really of a more hierarchical social structure, but also urban-level society. And these start to emerge in China from about 2000 BC. We have lots of evidence of earlier domestication. We saw this, and sedentism in multiple locations, northern and southern China, in their Neolithic revolution, when they were switching from hunting and gathering into farming and herding. And we see the emergence of, from this basis, of a complex urban society in northern China from about 2000 BC onwards to about 500 BC when we see these first three dynasties. So that dynasties, the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou dynasties. And this marks a transition into urban state society in China. The political center of these early dynasties were the Yi Luo Valley, and I have a map on your slideshow there that shows the location of that in China. And this early Xia dynasty may actually have had even a capital. Even though it probably wasn't an urban center, it may have had a center to it. So it maybe not urban population in the site of Erlitou, but it's quite possible this was a capital, that it was a cultural and economic and possibly even political center of this area in an emerging Xia dynasty. The reason why we think Erlitou might have been an early capital is because there were palaces that have been found, that two large palace enclosures with elite goods, things that you wouldn't find in just everyday households. Bronze, which is an alloy of copper, and in fact the earliest bronze ritual vessel was found there, but also precious things like jade objects were found, and this probably indicates to some sort of an elite political figure being in these palaces. Also, you find at the site of Yanxi massive palace enclosures as well. So it seems like we have an elite emerging at this time, even though the urban population hasn't quite agglomerated around particular sites. We will see that later on in Anyang, which is an urban, it's a city. But before Anyang, in the Yilu Valley, as I said, the Erlitou seems to have been a political center, possibly a capital of sorts. And it was Erlitou was inhabited from 1800 to about 1600 BC. So a couple hundred years there, and it was a large site with two large palaces and elite goods. And it's possible that, as I mentioned, Yanxi also had palace enclosures, and it appears a little bit later than Erlitou, so it might have actually, the political center might have shifted to Yanxi and taken over from Erlitou as a political center. Anyang, as I said, is a city, and so from about 1200 to about 1045 BC, so a couple hundred years there, a few hundred years after Erlitou, we find this is in the Shang dynasty, the late Shang dynasty. Anyang grows as an urban center. and it was the capital of the late Shang dynasty. We have writing probably predating even the periods that we're talking about here, some of the earliest non-traditional script emerging or in the 3rd millennium BC. But you also have by Anyang, you have the use of this script in very formalized situation. In for instance, oracle bones, which are usually the scapulae of animals, of domesticated animals, inscribe religious texts, oracle texts, predictions of the future, these sort of things onto these oracle bones. And this seems to be a standardized religious practice in dating to this period. And also you have bronze vessels in Anyang, which seems like Anyang as the capital had influence on some other sites like the Sanxingdui site, which is about 1,000 kilometers away, and you have some bronze vessels at Sanxingdui, which are very similar in style to the Anyang bronze vessels. But as we'll see in a moment, Sanxingdui might also have had independently minded, because they had their own style, very distinctive style of bronze production, as we'll see in a moment. So Anyang is this early city that we see urbanization building, and the layout was organized. They had neighborhoods that were designed. There's cemeteries that are designated areas, and workshop areas as well. So people's households were in one place. You had cemeteries in another place, workshops in another place. You also had the palace temple and platform, which was set aside for only the elites to use. Everyone else lived in pit houses, which are sort of semi-subterranean households. It's actually quite well insulated and a good place to live. Living in a pit house may not sound fun, but it's actually quite good structures. But it's certainly not living in a palace on a platform far above all of the rabble of the normal people in their neighborhoods. And so you have elite social structures that we find evidence for in the archaeological remains. Also, not just where the elites lived, but also they were buried with elite goods, differential access to wealth. Not everybody was buried with, like you get at Fuhao in Anyang, that had sacrificial victims. We've seen this already, that the ideology of the social structure is such that some people willingly or unwillingly were giving their lives to go to the afterlife with their elite masters. And the burials at Fuhao have both sacrificial victims and many, many grave goods of elite quality and status. Other sites that are contemporary to Anyang, in particular, I mentioned Sanxingdui, which was a large urbanized area, about 1,000 kilometers from Anyang. And when this was first discovered and excavated, the artistic style of it was just so distinctive, and it's really amazing. I have a photograph on a slideshow that shows one of the objects of distinctive style. Their bronze work was just really amazing, and it's so unique that it's different from what we get in Anyang. And so the relationship between what's happening in Anyang and Sanxingdui, we're not quite sure, because Sanxingdui also had some objects that look like they came and maybe even manufactured in Anyang. So there is some relationship, but we don't quite really know what that was. They could be competing city-states, they could be competing territorial states, they could be in cooperation with one another. They could be part of a larger entity. We're not quite sure. And also other sites in China. The Qifeng region has been surveyed, and it's shown through excavation and survey there that there was a relationship between the agricultural communities, the sedentary communities, and the pastoral communities, those that actually were semi-mobile, the ones who were herding animals, moving them around in the landscape. And so this was a relationship between the settled and the mobile groups. And in the Qifeng region, we see smaller scale communities shifting into larger settlements and increased population. And we're not quite sure how that relates in the Qifeng region to Senqingdui and Anyang. We're not quite sure how all of these pieces fit together. But in the next few decades, we're almost certain to have more information that will hopefully put these pieces together. The Rizhao survey as well is a survey of large urban sites that shows a similar four-tier settlement hierarchy. We've seen that before, where you have the large urban center, then you have smaller villages, then you have even smaller hamlets, and then you have even smaller still, that fourth tier of very small settlements. And this is in the Rizhao area that actually this four-tier settlement hierarchy predates Erlitou. And so you have other parts of China that are also on different trajectories towards urbanization. And large urban settlements, huge actually, I should say, huge settlements, Liangchenzhen, which is 273 hectares, just enormous sites, and Yaowangcheng, which is 368 hectares. I mean, these are just massive, massive sites that are in the part of the Rizhao survey. But you see a decline in the size of the urban areas and settled areas in the late Longsheng and Shang dynasties. In this area, you have smaller sites and fewer of them as well. So you see a sort of a decline in the urbanization of that area. So these early urban communities in China seem to be following a trajectory towards hierarchical social structure with elites at the top, organization of labor, with the more common people with different jobs doing these in a hierarchical top-down social structure. But the rulers do not appear to have been gods. So this is evidenced by a temple being on the platform where the elites were. So the rulers were engaging with the gods with a special status that the common people didn't have. So they were connected to divine beings, but they weren't gods themselves, like we have in Egypt, for instance, and later in Mesopotamia. And part of this relationship that the elites had with the gods was done through feasting, sacrificing, divining, like with the oracle bones. And so there were a concentration of wealth in these elites, and they used that wealth to commune and connect to the divine characters. And then in death, the elites were given elaborate burials involving sacrifices of both animals and humans, and the deposition of elite grave goods. So that was also thought, we think, has to do with this relationship between the elite humans and their divine counterparts. And we see a progression of this in by the Shang dynasty. The ancestors, the ancient people of your ancestry, become stratified as well, and so there's a cosmic stratification. So ancestors aren't just one size fits all, where you die and you become an ancestor. Actually, this ancestor is better than that ancestor, and things like feasting are for elites only. So you have an even greater development of social order as time goes on. Okay, that's all we've got for China, and we're going to next look at how China influenced some of the surrounding regions. I'll see you then.